In the rest of the chapter, we are going to talk about 3 different policies that can affect the equilibrium interest rate and saving and investment in the economy. The first policy is saving investment. American families usually save a smaller fraction of their incomes than their counterparts in many other countries. But in this chapter, we are not look at the reasons why Americans are saving less. It's actually unclear why some countries save more but some others do not. And we know that from chapter 12, country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. And one of the main determinant of productivity that affects the living standard is the saving, because when a country saves more, it can increase the long run growth and long run improvement in nation's productivity. So that means if there is an increase in the saving, that's actually important for us for having a long run economic growth. Here in this policy analysis, that we are going to find a policy that can actually increase the saving in the economy, and let's see how this increase in saving in the economy affects on the amount of investment. So in United States, people usually have low saving rates because this is partly attributable to tax laws that discourage saving. The US federal government as well as many state governments collects revenue by taxing income, like including interest and dividend income. Let me clarify this, how tax affects the income. Let's say, for instance, you are going to save today $1,000 and you buy a 30-year bond with an interest rate of 9%. In the absence of taxes, this $1,000 grows to $13,268 when the individual reaches, let me write this, maybe it's going to be better for us to understand. Let's say you save $1,000 and interest rate is 9%. Okay, in 30 years this amount will turn into $13,268. Okay, but if there is a tax rate of 33% on the return of the interest, then the net amount of interest you will get after tax will be 6%, because 1/3 of it goes to the tax, and this 1,000 in 30 years turns into $5,743. As you see, even less than half of it is going to be less. The amount will be less than maybe half if the interest rate is 9%. That is the reason maybe the Americans have low saving rates, because of paying tax too much. So let's go back to our example. Let's say now the government decides not to tax the saving accounts or the returns on saving. So this will for sure increase the amount of saving, because now people expect more return on their saving. They are not going to pay tax. But here in this problem, to analyze this, we should follow this 3-step procedure that we did in chapter 4. First, if there is a policy that the United States government decides, I'm not going to tax any returns on saving accounts, it's not only retirement but all saving accounts. First, we need to think about which curve would this policy affect. Because the tax change would alter the incentive for households to save at any given interest rate, it would affect the quantity of loanable funds supplied, right? Because as you know, the suppliers are the savers, and now savers are they have more reward because they don't have to pay tax to the government. So the supply at each given interest rate will be higher. That means supply curve. The second thing is we will think about in which direction would the supply curve shift. The supply curve will shift to the right. You see here in this example, the supply curve will shift to the right, because now at each given interest rate, the households or the people who wants to save more, because now they can get a better return without tax. And the third step is we need to compare these two equilibria before the policy implemented and after the policy implemented. Before that, the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate, as you see here, is 5%. Now, because there are more money available in the banks, mutual funds, everywhere to be given as loan, more money, the interest rate will decrease the 4%. Okay, so you can do the easiest way to solve this kind of problems in exams or quizzes is to draw the graph. On the vertical axis interest rate, on the horizontal axis the quantity of loanable funds, and you know that by now the supply side are the savers and the policies affecting savers, because the savers are not going to pay tax on their return that they get from the saving accounts. And now the three steps analyzing the policy is: first, which curve is going to be affected, supply, in which direction supply will increase at each given interest rate. And now the third one is comparing the old equilibrium and the new one. As you see, at the new equilibrium, the quantity of loanable funds in the market will increase from 60 to 70 and interest rate will be lower. You may think that since interest rate lower, because now there are more money available in the market for borrowing, there will be more people demanding for loans, so there's going to be an adjustment through the demand curve here, you see here, to the new equilibrium point. So there will be more funds available in the market for borrowing, plus the demand for borrowing increased because the interest rate is now lower. Okay, that is how you can analyze a policy change on markets for loanable funds. So let's make a conclusion. If a reform of tax laws encourage greater saving, the result would be lower interest rate and greater investment. Second policy, now there are incentives not on saving but investment. You may think that this can be in the form of investment tax credit. An investment tax credit gives a tax advantage to any firm building a new factory or buying a new piece of equipment. Now the first question, again, we will use this three-step analysis. The first thing is, would the law affect the supply or demand? Since tax credit on investments, so if a firm builds a new factory, there is going to be a tax deduction. Okay, think that way. So since now investment becomes more attractive to the people, to the firms, to the businesses, then as you realize that demand side will be affected, because you know that the demand side is the one who wants to borrow money to do investment. Supply is the one supplying money to the borrowers, which is the saving side. So the first question is answered, because the tax credit would reward firms that borrow and invest in new capital. It would alter investment at any given interest rate and thereby change the demand for loanable funds. Now second step, in which direction the demand will change. Is it going to increase? There will be more demand for money for borrowing or less demand for money for borrowing or investment. As you realize, there is going to be an incentive. If you do investment, you will have a reduced tax. That means the demand curve for the loanable funds will increase. People want to borrow more money because there is investment becomes attractive. So the demand curve will shift to the right. Okay, now we decided demand, and we decided that demand is going to shift to the right. And the third step is comparing these two equilibria. In the initial equilibrium, the interest rate was 5% and 60 billion loans were given and demanded. But now, since there is the investment becomes attractive, people demand more money to borrow, and the new interest rate is 6%, and the new loanable funds, the amount will be $60 billion. So you may think that since interest rate is increasing because people want to borrow money, more savers get into the market, so the supply of loanable funds also increases at the same time to catch the people's demand with an increasing interest rate. So as a summary, if a reform of the tax laws encourage greater investment, the result would be higher interest rate and greater saving. Now we are going to talk about the third policy, which is a little bit complicated, but it's easy if you understand the idea of supply and demand of loanable funds. Now we are going to use the loanable funds model to analyze the effects of a government budget deficit. First, we will draw the diagram showing the initial equilibrium. And second, we will determine which curve shifts when the government runs a budget deficit. And then third, we will draw a new curve on our diagram. And then the last part is comparing the equilibrium and values of interest rate and investment. So let's do that. First, what we said, in the supply side, supply is saving. And we know that saving is not only private saving, but also public saving. So public saving is part of the supply curve. So when you draw a supply here, public saving, if the government is running a surplus, is adding to the national saving. But here, as you realize that now the government runs the budget deficit. That means now the amount of loans available from the saver side is going down because now public is running a deficit, is not having a surplus adding to the saving amount, but is running a deficit. So as you see, there will be less funds available from the saver's side. That means the supply of loanable funds will be less than before. Okay, if that is the case, now let's draw our graph. This is the quantity of loanable funds, and this is the interest rate. Let's start before that the government doesn't run a deficit. There's going to be an equilibrium from supply and demand. There's going to be an interest rate and the amount of loans in the market. But now what happened is that now government is running a budget deficit. That means the supply of saver side, there will be less funds available. Okay, now the supply of loanable funds decreases. Why it's decreasing is because the total saving is the sum of private saving plus public saving, but now public saving is not a positive number, it's taking from the available loans. That means there's going to be less saving available for people to invest. Now let's compare let's say this is the previous equilibrium I star. Let's compare our new equilibrium here. The demand side is not going to be affected because demand side are the ones who want to borrow money. Okay, they are ready for investment, but government saving is including in the saving supply side of the market. You see, at new equilibrium, there will be less loanable funds. Let's say here 70, now 60 billion loanable funds, and the interest rate will be higher than before. So the government deficit is important because when there is a government deficit, we have one main problem. Because the government deficit reduces the national saving, the total saving, by running a budget deficit, and the interest rate rises and investment falls because now the people who are getting loaned for investment drops from 70 to 60. So investment is less, as you see. So this is the basic lesson. We learned that government deficit is not good for economic growth, because for economic growth we want more saving. We want more saving because we want people to borrow money and invest, produce new capital goods, open a factory, buy houses. You may think about many things that you can include as purchasing and buying of new capital. But here, since government deficit reduces the available saving in the economy for borrowers, that reduces the amount of investment, which is the important thing for economic growth. Okay. Here is the solution. And in our analysis, increase in budget deficit causes fall in investment. The government borrows to finance its deficit and leaving less funds available for investment. We call this as crowding out. Okay, when government spends more money, let's say for military, national defense, It's actually using the resources that is available for private investment, like building factories or building new capital goods. That is called as crowding out because government spending is crowds out the private investment. Okay. And recall from the preceding chapter, investment is important for long-run economic growth. Hence, budget deficit reduced the economy's growth rate and future standards of living. And when we look at the US government debt, the government finances deficit by borrowing, selling government bonds, and there is persistent deficit that leads to a rising government debt. The ratio of government debt to GDP is a useful measure of the government's indebtedness relative to its ability to raise tax revenue. And historically, the debt-GDP ratio usually rises during wartime. You may expect that because the government spends for national defense, and falls during peacetime and until the early 1980s. Look at the graph, you'll realize that government debt increases, debt to GDP ratio increases during Revolutionary Civil War, First World War, War I, Second World, and financial crisis too. Okay. So this ends the chapter. Like many other markets, financial markets are governed by the force of supply and demand. And one of the 10 principles from chapter 1, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity, and financial markets help allocate the economy's scarce resources to their most efficient uses. And financial markets also link the present to the future. They enable savers to convert current income into future purchasing power and borrowers to acquire capital to produce goods and services in the future. So you can find a summary of this chapter also. But as you realize that now we complete the picture, we see the relation between saving and investment. Investment is important for us for the future living standards. So it's important to understand the relation between saving and investment, and we connect saving and investment through the markets for loanable funds. And we also learn some policies that can affect the amount of saving and the interest rate in the market that may lead to a change in the investment in the market.